Montana, 1996. A 15-year-old girl named Danielle Danni. Houchins left her home one morning in Belgrade and never came back. Hours later, her truck was discovered abandoned at a fishing access site near the Gallatin River. That night, her body was found face down in shallow water, the victim of a brutal crime that stunned the community. For nearly 3 decades, investigators chased shadows. Leads vanished. DNA sat waiting. Families grieved in silence. But in 2023, a scientific breakthrough would finally shatter the silence. Using forensic genealogy, authorities identified a suspect, a man hiding in plain sight. What followed was both justice and tragedy. Before we begin, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. In 1996, Belgrade, Montana was a small town where trust still ran deep and danger felt like something that happened elsewhere. Tucked just outside of Bozeman, it was a place of open skies, wheat fields, and quiet, winding roads that led to fishing holes and picnic spots along the Gallatin River. It was the kind of town where you knew your neighbor's dog by name, and where a teenage girl like Danielle Danni, Houchins, could grow up with a sense of freedom most kids today wouldn't recognize. At just 15, Danni was the embodiment of youthful energy and quiet independence. A sophomore in high school, she was known for her curiosity and her heart. Her teachers spoke of her as a bright student who asked thoughtful questions, while friends remembered her laugh, the kind that turned heads in the hallway. She wasn't the loudest in the room, but she had presence. The kind of girl who offered a listening ear, even when she didn't know what to say. Her family adored her. She was the middle child between 2 siblings and often played the role of the peacemaker. Her mother recalled Danni's love for nature, how she'd sometimes take her truck down to the river just to sit, sketch, or think. She wasn't rebellious. She wasn't troubled. She simply enjoyed a bit of solitude in a world that was already starting to move too fast. Danni had a routine. School in the mornings. Chores in the afternoon. Occasionally, if the weather was good, she'd take a short drive to the nearby fishing access site. She didn't fish, she just liked the quiet. On September 21st, 1996, that routine continued as normal. She left the house just before noon, telling her mother she'd be back in a couple of hours. She wasn't dressed for anything formal, just jeans and a sweatshirt. It was a typical Saturday. But by dinner time, concerns started to creep in. Calls to her friends yielded nothing. Nobody had seen her since the morning. Her mother tried to shake the worry, telling herself that maybe Danni had just lost track of time. But when the sun dipped behind the mountains and the sky turned from gold to ash, the unease solidified into fear. They called the sheriff's office. A missing person report was filed. Volunteers and deputies started checking the usual places: friends' houses, local gas stations, the nearby river pull-offs. The first real clue came not from law enforcement, but from Danni's own mother. Following a mother's instinct, she drove toward one of Danni's favorite thinking spots, the Cameron Bridge fishing access on the Gallatin River. And there, parked in a gravel lot, was Danni's truck. The keys were still inside. The doors were unlocked. But Danni was nowhere to be found. The gravity of the situation was now undeniable. This wasn't a case of a teenager staying out too late or blowing off her curfew. Something had gone wrong. The community responded instantly. Search parties formed. Flashlights cut through the darkness as people called out her name, hoping to hear a reply. But the only sound that returned was the wind rustling the river reeds. Danni's sudden disappearance was more than a shock. It was the cracking of a foundation in a town that believed it was safe. As the first night gave way to the cold, early morning hours, the one question hanging over everyone remained unanswered. Where had Danni gone, and why hadn't she come back? Saturday, September 21st, 1996, began with the kind of crisp morning Montana is known for: clear skies, the scent of harvested fields in the air, and a breeze just strong enough to rustle the cottonwoods near the Gallatin River. For Danielle Danni, Houchins, it was supposed to be a quiet weekend. No big plans, just a chance to breathe, catch up on homework, and maybe head down to one of her favorite thinking spots along the river. She left the house around 11 a.m., telling her mother she'd be back soon. It wasn't unusual. Danni often drove herself around town, especially to peaceful places like the Cameron Bridge fishing access. It was her escape, a place to sit with a sketch pad or just think with the water rushing by. Witnesses later recalled seeing her truck driving south, heading in the general direction of the river. But that would be the last time anyone would see her alive. As afternoon turned to evening, Danni still hadn't returned. Her mother, at first, brushed off the growing worry. Maybe she got caught up with friends. Maybe she was helping someone out and lost track of time. But as the sun dropped below the mountains and the clock crept past dinner, her absence became impossible to ignore. Calls to friends were met with confusion. No one had seen or heard from Danni since the morning. Her room was undisturbed. Her wallet and keys weren't in the house. Her mother's instincts, those quiet alarms that live in the gut of every parent, began to scream. Around 7:30 p.m., Danni was officially reported missing. Deputies with the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office responded, starting with the usual questions. Was she prone to running away? Any recent arguments? Had she been upset? The answers were all no. Shortly after filing the report, Danni's mother did what many parents would do when panic overtakes protocol. She began searching on her own. She drove out toward the river, scanning gravel pull-offs and shoulder cuts. That's when she spotted it. Danni's truck, parked at the Cameron Bridge fishing access. The doors were unlocked. The keys were inside. There were no signs of struggle, no shattered glass, no blood, no obvious damage. But the silence screamed louder than any alarm. Police were called back to the scene. The gravity of the situation escalated. The site was quickly roped off as a potential crime scene. Search teams began deploying into the surrounding woods and along the banks of the Gallatin River. Volunteers, many of them classmates, neighbors, and strangers, joined in the search. Flashlights pierced through the brush. Dogs were brought in to pick up any trace scent. The air turned colder as the hours ticked on. The river, now inky and dark, moved swiftly, concealing whatever secrets lay beneath its surface. The only sounds were boots crunching on gravel and voices shouting her name into the night. And then, just after midnight, a call came over the radio. One of the volunteers, searching a stretch of river not far from the truck, had found something in the water. It was a body. Female. Young. Deputies rushed to the scene and confirmed what no one wanted to believe. Danielle Houchins had been found, face down in shallow water near the reeds, her body partially submerged. There were no visible wounds, no easy answers. Shock rippled through the gathered crowd. Some wept. Others stood silently, hands clenched, breath frozen in the night air. The light had gone out in Belgrade. A girl full of life and promise was gone. And now, only one question remained. What happened to her in those final hours by the water? The moment authorities pulled Danielle Danni, Houchins' lifeless body from the shallow Gallatin River, the mood among the responders shifted from tense hope to stunned grief. It was after midnight when the discovery was made, her small frame barely visible in the water, partially covered by reeds and mud. The river's gentle current lapped against her, but what it concealed was far from peaceful. Her face was submerged, pressed into the marshy bottom. Investigators noted the condition of her body immediately. There were visible abrasions on her arms and neck. Her clothing was askew. While there was no immediate sign of blunt force trauma, early indicators suggested that a violent struggle had taken place, one that likely ended with suffocation and sexual assault. As searchlights turned into crime scene lighting, the site was locked down. The scene was photographed, sketched, and processed inch by inch. Forensics technicians worked into the early hours, collecting fibers, soil, fingerprints, and, critically, hair samples. 4 strands were retrieved from Danni's body and clothing. In 1996, the collection of DNA was still a developing science. Databases like Cody's were relatively new and only held limited profiles. Unless the killer had a criminal record, there would be no match. Still, investigators hoped. They bagged the samples and preserved them carefully. These fragments, silent, biological time capsules, would be all they had to connect the killer to the crime. The community of Belgrade, meanwhile, was plunged into mourning and fear. Danni's murder wasn't just a tragic loss. It was a violation of everything the town believed about itself. It wasn't just that she had died. It was how. A teenage girl attacked near a public access point in broad daylight. Her body left just a yard from where families fished and children played. The horror of it was unshakable. In the days that followed, tips poured in. Rumors circled like vultures. Some claimed they'd seen a suspicious vehicle in the area that afternoon. Others pointed fingers at known troublemakers or past offenders. The sheriff's office followed each lead. They canvassed the fishing access site, checked gas station footage, what little there was, and cross-checked alibis. But nothing held. Every suspect had an alibi. Every path they pursued turned cold. No witnesses came forward. No confession emerged. There was no known connection between Danni and any potential suspect. She had no boyfriend, no enemies, no reason to be targeted. And that made it even worse. Her family stood before cameras, pleading for information. Her father spoke with a shaking voice about the kind of person Danni was. Her mother, holding back tears, begged anyone with knowledge to come forward. A reward was offered. But even with media attention growing across the state, the silence was deafening. With no motive, no suspect, and no witness, the case began to slip from headlines into uncertainty. The evidence was there, collected, cataloged, and sealed away. But it lacked the one thing investigators needed: a match. Someone, somewhere, had left their trace on Danni. But without modern technology to identify it, that trace might as well have been invisible. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the hope of resolution grew dimmer. Detectives kept the case active, but momentum was fading. Eventually, the leads would stop coming. The case would gather dust, like so many others. But inside that evidence locker, the truth was still waiting. 4 hairs, 1 river, 1 brutal end to a young life. Could the evidence collected that night hold the key? Just not yet. In the aftermath of Danielle Houchins' murder, the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office launched a full-scale investigation. The community demanded answers, and law enforcement poured every available resource into the effort. They began with the basics, mapping out Danni's known routines, building a timeline of her final hours, and speaking with anyone who had contact with her that day. Detectives visited Belgrade High School to speak with classmates and teachers. Counselors made themselves available to students, many of whom were still in shock. Danni had no known enemies. She wasn't involved in any risky behavior. There were no reports of recent arguments, breakups, or suspicious strangers approaching her. The police extended their reach, going door to door along the rural roads between Belgrade and the Cameron Bridge fishing access. Anyone who might have seen her truck that afternoon was interviewed. Gas station attendants were questioned. A few nearby stores had security cameras, but the footage was grainy and often recorded over within days. No clear image of Danni, or anyone following her, emerged. Attention turned to the fishing site. Officers noted that it was a public location, frequently visited by locals and travelers alike. Several older men known to frequent the area were identified and brought in for questioning. A few raised red flags. One man, in particular, had a prior record for harassment. Another had failed a polygraph test. But neither could be conclusively tied to the crime. The sheriff's office remained tight-lipped about suspects. Behind the scenes, they worked tirelessly to compare tire tracks, examine clothing fibers, and, most importantly, send the 4 hairs found on Danni's body to a lab for analysis. But in 1996, DNA testing was far more limited than today. Without a known suspect or a match in the newly established Cody system, the evidence sat in limbo. As the weeks dragged on, public pressure mounted. The local newspaper published editorials calling for answers. The community held vigils. Tips trickled in, some hopeful, others misguided. Psychics called in. Anonymous letters arrived. One claimed to know the killer's identity, but the information proved false. Another suggested a drifter had been seen in the area, but nothing came of it. The sheriff's investigators, stretched thin, began to feel the weight of a case with no clear path forward. Officers rotated in and out of the case as new priorities emerged. Without solid leads, time became the enemy. And in the absence of arrests, rumors spread like wildfire. Some in town believed the killer must have known Danni. How else would they have lured her into vulnerability? Others feared a random predator was at large, blending in unnoticed. Parents began restricting their children's movements. Trust eroded. The peaceful fabric of Belgrade had been torn, and the wound wasn't healing. Meanwhile, the physical evidence remained locked in a secure storage unit, sealed in sterile bags and labeled by case number. The hair samples were marked for preservation, with the hope that future testing might yield answers. It was the only concrete link to the person who had taken Danni's life. But without a match, the science had reached its limits. Months passed. The case, once the top priority for Gallatin County, slowly receded into the background. Detectives moved on to newer crimes. Media coverage thinned. Danni's name remained in the hearts of her loved ones. But for the public, the silence was deafening. The early investigation had been thorough. The leads had been pursued, but justice was still out of reach. Would the killer remain among them, unnoticed, unsuspected, and unpunished? As the years passed, the murder of Danielle Danni, Houchins, slowly faded from public conversation. But for her family, time only deepened the pain. Danni's death wasn't a chapter that closed. It was a weight that settled in their bones. Life in Belgrade, Montana, had changed. What was once a town of wide-open trust became a place where memories lurked behind every familiar bend in the road. Her mother still drove past the Cameron Bridge fishing access, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. And every time, it felt like reliving that night all over again. Danni's sister, Stephanie, had to grow up in a house where joy had been replaced with silence. There were birthdays with an empty chair, holidays haunted by what-ifs, and school milestones Danni never got to reach. Her room was left nearly untouched, a shrine of frozen time. The sheriff's department, after an initial burst of effort, had little to show. The physical evidence, meticulously gathered and preserved, remained locked away, but with no match in the limited DNA systems of the late 90s and early 2000s, the case stalled. Detectives moved on. Some retired. Files shifted to deeper shelves. Cold case reviews occurred sporadically. A detective might glance through the folder, reread witness interviews, flip through black and white crime scene photos. But without new leads or technology, those reviews often ended where they began, with frustration. For the public, the memory of Danni's murder dulled. News cycles moved on. Other tragedies, other names, other heartbreaks took their place. But for Danni's family, every day was a reminder. Her mother became an outspoken presence at cold case vigils across the state. She lit candles, gave quiet interviews, and wrote letters to state representatives advocating for better funding of forensic technology. She never stopped asking, why hasn't her daughter's killer been brought to justice? Stephanie, now a grown woman, found herself navigating the shadow of a sister who never got the chance to become one. She often wondered what Danni would have done with her life. Would she have traveled? Gone to college? Gotten married? Those questions never left. Then, more than 2 decades later, in 2019, a spark reignited the investigation. Under new leadership, the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office launched a renewed review of unsolved cases. With advances in forensic science and growing pressure from families across Montana, cold cases were once again getting attention. Among the stack of files pulled for review, Danni's case stood out. The new sheriff and his team knew the history. They knew the pain that still lingered in the community, and they believed in something the previous era hadn't had, the possibility of technology catching up to the past. In a quiet but deliberate move, they reopened the file and began re-evaluating every piece of evidence, starting with the 4 hairs recovered in 1996. It wasn't a grand announcement. There were no press conferences, no public declarations, just a quiet commitment behind closed doors to take one more look. Still, the passage of time loomed large. Evidence degrades. Memories fade. People move, die, disappear. The odds weren't in their favor. But this time, they had tools the original investigators couldn't have imagined. Now, With the file reopened and the DNA evidence being revisited, a new question hovered over the case. After all these years, would any of the evidence still matter? By 2021, the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office had reopened the file on Danielle Houchins' murder, but they needed outside help to break through nearly 3 decades of silence. That's when they turned to someone with a reputation for getting results in cold cases, Tom Elfmont, a retired detective from the Los Angeles Police Department. Elfmont had worked some of California's toughest homicide cases and brought with him a no-nonsense approach, sharp instincts, and an unshakable belief in the power of modern forensics. He wasn't alone. Joining him was Sergeant Court Deepweg from a Newport Beach Police Department, a seasoned investigator with deep expertise in DNA-driven investigations. Together, their goal was simple: go back to the beginning and wring every possible clue out of the evidence collected in 1996. They started with the 4 hairs that had been carefully preserved from Danny's body. Each was bagged, tagged, and stored under controlled conditions, waiting for science to catch up. The samples were sent to Astria Forensics, a California-based lab known for pushing the boundaries of degraded DNA analysis. From one of the hairs, a partial DNA profile was extracted. It was a breakthrough, more complete than anything obtained in earlier years. The profile was uploaded into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system. But once again, silence. The profile yielded no matches. The killer's DNA was not in any criminal database. No arrests, no convictions, no record. For a moment, it seemed history might repeat itself. But Elfmont and Deepweg weren't done. They turned to Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia, a company that had revolutionized forensic genealogy. Parabon had gained national attention for using DNA to build family trees, tracing suspects through relatives rather than relying on direct criminal matches. With permission from the sheriff's office, Parabon's genealogists began their work. They used the DNA profile to search public and private genealogy databases, slowly mapping out ancestral connections. It was meticulous, painstaking work, cross-referencing decades of birth records, census data, obituaries, and online family trees. And then a name emerged: Paul Hutchinson. He wasn't a known criminal. There was nothing in his background that pointed to violence or abuse. Hutchinson was a 55-year-old man living in Dillon, Montana. He had attended Montana State University back in the 1990s, the same period when Danni was murdered. He'd studied fisheries and wildlife biology, graduated, started a family, and gone on to work for the Bureau of Land Management for more than 2 decades. He had a wife, children, a career, a quiet life. But the genetic trail led to him with increasing certainty. In July 2023, law enforcement arranged to question Hutchinson. He agreed to meet voluntarily, unaware of the full scope of the evidence pointing to him. According to those in the room, Hutchinson was visibly rattled. He fidgeted constantly, sweating profusely, and avoided eye contact. When shown a photograph of Danni, he reportedly slumped in his chair and became increasingly agitated. His answers were vague, evasive. The interview lasted 2 hours. Detectives didn't arrest him yet. They planned to gather more evidence and bring him back in for follow-up. But Hutchinson wouldn't return. Just hours after the interview, at around 4:15 a.m., Hutchinson called the Beaverhead County Sheriff's Office. He gave no explanation, just a request for help, then abruptly hung up. When deputies located him shortly after on a rural roadside, it was already too late. Hutchinson had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The news hit investigators hard. Had they just lost their only suspect? Or had they just confirmed him? Was his suicide a silent confession, or a tragic coincidence hiding a deeper truth? In traditional investigations, an arrest signals justice in motion. A suspect handcuffed, read their rights, brought before court. But in the case of Danielle, Danni, Houchins, justice would come in a different, more haunting form. Paul Hutchinson, the man whose DNA now matched the evidence preserved for nearly 3 decades, would never stand trial. After Hutchinson's unexpected suicide, investigators acted swiftly. They obtained a post-mortem DNA sample and sent it for comparison. The test was conclusive. The DNA found on Danni collected from the hair retrieved in 1996, was a complete and indisputable match to Hutchinson. The cold case had cracked wide open. He had lived undetected for 27 years. A married man, a father of two, a respected employee with the Montana Bureau of Land Management. To those around him, he was unremarkable in the best way. Quiet, polite, reliable. There were no red flags, no whispers of violence or abuse. He'd built a life surrounded by colleagues, neighbors, and friends who would later express disbelief. Hutchinson had no criminal record, not even a traffic violation. And perhaps most chilling of all, investigators found no prior connection between him and Danni. They weren't acquaintances. He wasn't a family friend. They had never been in the same social circles. The theory was horrifying in its randomness. He had likely encountered Danni by chance that September afternoon in 1996 at the Cameron Bridge fishing access. It was a crime of opportunity. The evidence suggested he may have approached her, perhaps under the guise of small talk. Maybe he asked for help. Maybe he caught her off guard. No one knows exactly what transpired in those final moments, but what followed was a violent assault and murder committed in daylight in a public space by a man who blended back into society without a trace. When authorities made the announcement that the case was officially closed, the public reaction was a collision of emotions. There was relief. After nearly 30 years, Danni's family finally had a name. They no longer had to wonder who had stolen her life. There was outrage. How could a man who lived less than 200 miles away, who had ties to the region and a quiet government job, have remained invisible to investigators for so long? And there was fear, because if someone like Paul Hutchinson could commit such a heinous crime and live undetected for decades, who else might be out there? Law enforcement made it clear that, while the case of Danielle Houchins was now closed, their work was not done. They opened an extended investigation into Hutchinson's past, revisiting other cold cases across Montana and surrounding states. Did he have patterns of travel? Were there unsolved assaults or disappearances along his career path? Nothing definitive has surfaced yet, but the questions remain. The man behind Danni's murder had lived as a ghost in plain sight, attending barbecues, raising children, going to work. No outward signs of darkness. No slip-ups. For nearly 3 decades, he carried the weight of an unpunished crime and said nothing. Now, his death meant he would never face a courtroom, never hear a verdict, never answer the questions that haunted a family for years. But the DNA didn't lie. The truth had finally been pulled from the silence. And still, the question lingered like a shadow over the investigation. Were there others? Justice, for many families, comes with the image of a courtroom, witnesses taking the stand, a suspect facing judgment, and a verdict delivered before the eyes of the public. But for Danielle Houchins' loved ones, that moment would never come. The man responsible for her death had died by suicide, just hours after police confronted him with suspicions. There would be no trial, no confession, no cross-examination, no sentence. Instead, there was silence. Paul Hutchinson took with him the details of what happened along the Gallatin River on September 21st, 1996. He left no note, no apology, no admission, just a void where accountability should have been. And for Danni's family, the emotional aftermath was more complex than anyone could prepare for. At a press conference held shortly after the DNA match was confirmed and the case was declared closed, Danni's younger sister, Stephanie Mollett, stepped in front of the cameras. Her voice shook, not from uncertainty, but from a depth of emotion long held back. She spoke of the years spent wondering who had done it, of birthdays missed, of the pain that never dulled. She expressed relief that her sister's name had finally been tied to a killer, but she also voiced bitter truth. He had escaped the full weight of justice. He never had to sit in a courtroom and hear what he did to her, she said. He never had to face us, or a jury, or even say her name again. Still, she called the DNA results irrefutable closure, a definitive answer after decades of uncertainty. The killer was no longer a faceless ghost in their nightmares. He had a name, a life, a history, and now an end. Investigators, too, acknowledged the case's significance. Sheriff Dan Springer addressed the public, emphasizing the power of forensic science and the importance of preserving evidence. He called Danni's case a testament to patience and persistence. "We never gave up on finding the truth," he said. "And though justice didn't come in the form we hoped for, it came nonetheless." The sheriff's office used the resolution to highlight new protocols, better preservation of forensic material, deeper collaboration with private labs, and earlier use of genealogical tools. Danni's case, they said, would become a template for other departments across the country trying to crack cold cases. But in the community of Belgrade, the emotions were still raw. People who had known Hutchinson were stunned. He had lived a quiet life, a civil servant, a father, a man who volunteered for local events. Was it possible they had missed signs? Had there been warning flags that no one recognized? Those questions echoed through churches, schools, and city meetings in the weeks that followed. Parents clutched their children a little tighter. Neighbors looked twice. In small towns, the idea of danger hiding in plain sight hits differently. It shakes the ground beneath everything that feels familiar. For the Houchins family, there was no true victory, but there was validation. Danielle's case was no longer just a story in an old file. It had been solved. Her life and death had mattered, and yet the unresolved emotions lingered. What drove Hutchinson to that riverbank that day? Why Danni? Was it really just random? Or was there more? Without a trial, those questions might never be answered. But perhaps the bigger question remained. What lessons would this case leave behind? Nearly 3 decades after Danielle Houchins was taken from her family, her story has transformed from a tragic mystery into a lasting legacy. What was once a symbol of heartbreak has become a beacon of perseverance, proof of how time, technology, and the unwavering love of a family can bend the arc of justice, even when it seems hopeless. Danielle is no longer remembered solely as the 15-year-old girl who vanished by Montana River. Today, she is remembered as the spark that reignited hope in the cold case community. Her name is spoken in training seminars, forensic conferences, and law enforcement meetings across the country. She has become a case study, not for how she died, but for how her case was solved. Her family, still scarred by loss, but determined to bring meaning from it, turned their grief into advocacy. Danni's mother and sister have campaigned for expanded funding for forensic genealogy programs and cold case units throughout Montana and beyond. Their message is simple but powerful. Every unsolved case matters. Every piece of evidence could be the one that cracks it open. No family should wait 27 years for answers. In Belgrade, annual memorial events are now held in Danielle's honor. These gatherings aren't just about mourning. They're about remembering, educating, and motivating. Law enforcement officers speak alongside forensic experts. Students learn about DNA breakthroughs. Survivors of violence share their stories. And at the center of it all is Danni, a girl whose voice still echoes, not through sound, but through the change her story has inspired. The Gallatin County Sheriff's Office has also changed. The agency that once stored her evidence in hopes of future answers now uses her case as a guiding light. Cold case files that sat untouched for decades are being re-examined with fresh urgency. Investigators are being trained on the latest genealogical techniques. Partnerships with labs like Parabon Nanolabs are now standard practice, not last resorts. Even as Danni's case was closed, one thread remained active: the question of whether Paul Hutchinson had other victims. Investigators continue to comb through unsolved assaults and disappearances, especially those near areas where Hutchinson lived or worked. Every tip, no matter how old, is reevaluated with renewed purpose. No stone is being left unturned. Danni's case has become a rallying cry for victims' families across the country. Proof that silence doesn't have to last forever, that technology can uncover truth buried for decades, and that persistence matters. Her life, though cut tragically short, continues to make a difference. She is remembered in newspaper features, community walls, and digital archives. Her face, once posted on missing posters, now accompanies headlines like "Cold Case, Solved Through DNA," and "Justice for Danielle." For many, she is a symbol of hope, and yet her story raises a sobering question. How many more cases like hers still sit in dusty file drawers? How many families still wait, still wonder, still carry that same silence in their homes? Danni's legacy demands that we keep looking, that we keep pressing forward, that we believe no case is ever truly closed until the truth is found. Her voice may have been silenced that day in 1996, but thanks to science, advocacy, and a family that never gave up, her story is still speaking loud and clear. Can science finally close every cold case like this? Maybe not. But because of Danielle Houchins, we know that it can. Danielle Danni. Houchins' story is one that echoes through time. A 15-year-old girl full of dreams, taken from her family and community in a single, brutal act. For nearly 30 years, her murder remained unsolved. Her name became another line in a cold case file. Her photo, another face on a forgotten wall. But Danni's family never let her story fade, and neither did the science. What once felt like dead ends eventually gave way to breakthroughs. Thanks to the evolution of DNA technology and the rise of forensic genealogy, what was invisible in 1996 became clear in 2023. A partial DNA profile, extracted from a single preserved hair, led to a name. And though Paul Hutchinson would never face a courtroom or speak a word in defense, the truth was undeniable. His DNA was on Danni. The case was solved. Though there was no arrest, no trial, and no conviction, justice, in its purest form, arrived through facts. It arrived through science. It arrived through a family's unwillingness to let go. Danni's legacy now lives in reform, in renewed cold case efforts, and in the hope she's offered other families still waiting for answers. Her voice may have been silenced that day by the river, but her story now speaks louder than ever. This case reminds us that justice has no expiration date, that even decades later, truth can still be found, and that one girl's story can inspire a nationwide shift in how we fight for the forgotten. If Danielle's story moved you, share it. Speak her name. Because justice delayed doesn't mean justice denied. And somewhere, in another evidence locker, another answer waits, just like Danni's once did.